just to make sure. Okay.
It's good?
Yeah, we're all good. So you'll see me. I'll let you, oh, here's your glasses. I'll let you know if things aren't good.
Yes.
You should be, I guess.
Yeah. I'm not going to shut it all the way. Okay. Yep. We're doing a broadcast presentation from the building tonight. Starting in like 2 minutes. Just so you know. We're going to keep this door mostly shut. No. Well, it's not going to be noisy. It's more like if you are really noisy, you'll be heard through the whole World Wide Web.
No pressure.
Maybe we'll just move this little one over.
So this isn't the time to criticize the OSP. Okay. We got 8 viewers.
Do we? Rock on.
So far.
I was going to start like this. Hello and welcome to the OFCP broadcast. We're going to be starting in 1 minute. We're just testing our audio and then we'll get going.
Audio's fine.
Okay, good. Okay, I think we're ready to start. Hello, everybody, and welcome to our webcast this evening. The Ontario Federation for Cerebral Palsy is excited to host this presentation tonight and offer training and guidance to those who have been appointed as trustees of a Henson Trust. Hopefully, the information presented will make the duties and responsibilities of being a trustee easier to understand and perform. My name is Cindy DeGraff, and I'm the coordinator of the Long-Term Planning and Support Program at the OFCP. And one of the goals of our program is to produce materials that will assist families in planning for the future. And those families who have a member with a disability, this is especially important. Over the years, we have produced a number of resources to assist in this process. 2 of them that I'd like to highlight tonight are our estate planning guide called Removing the Mystery, and more recently our trustee reference manual, a guide for trustees of a Henson Trust. Both of these manuals were written by Graham Treby, a consultant to the Long-Term Planning and Support Program, and he will be our guest speaker for the evening. He is also the founder of his own business called the Special Needs Planning Group. Before we get underway, I would like to remind you that if you have any questions during the presentation tonight, you may send an email to the email address below the screen that you are watching, below the visual that you are watching. The address is webcast@ofcp.ca. Graham will try and answer as many questions as he can throughout the evening. For those he is unable to get to, he will reply to them as soon as he can via email back to you. Also, if you're unable to stay online for the entire broadcast, which we expect to take approximately 1 hour and 15 minutes, we are recording tonight's presentation and we will be making this available at a later date. Now, I think we are ready to begin. Let's welcome Graham and get underway with the trustee training session. Thank you once again for joining us tonight.
Yeah, thanks very much, Cindy, for the introduction and the explanation of the process. My name is Graham Treby, and my biggest claim to fame is that I'm a parent of 3 children. My oldest daughter is 36 years of age. I was very young when she was born. And she's made me a grandfather twice. It's terrific. I get to spoil the grandchildren rotten and then give them back, and it's a little bit of sweet revenge. I also have a 26-year-old son and a 23-year-old daughter, Jenny. Jenny has cerebral palsy and PDD and a seizure disorder and a sleep disorder and developmental delay, a whole lot of issues in one little package. And back in 1990, my wife and I realized that we really needed to do some planning for Jenny. So we visited with our family lawyer and put together a will, and we really thought we had done a great job of providing for her long-term well-being and security, until I realized that by leaving money directly to her, we had pretty much guaranteed that she would not qualify for the Ontario Government Support Program, the ODSP. And that wasn't our goal. Our goal was basically to provide a decent quality of life for our daughter. We wanted to make sure that she had the warm winter coat and decent clothing, a TV set in her room, and just all the comforts and pleasures that we take for granted. By doing the will in the wrong format, we realized, or we discovered very quickly, that she wasn't going to receive those things because of the lack of government funding. So to make a very long story short, my wife and I spent the next 2 years talking to other lawyers, talking to people from the Ministry of Community and Social Services, and just about anybody who had any information. And ultimately, we found that there were some things that we could do as parents that would allow Jenny to have the quality of life that we wanted for her, as well as let her participate in the Ontario Government support programs. And one of those basic tools that we've discovered was a thing called the Henson Trust. And that's what we're here tonight to talk about. I'd like to elaborate a little bit about what Cindy had also mentioned, and I'll start by changing the slides. That was always good when you push the button and nothing happens. We'll try again. It worked beautifully a little while ago, of course. Try again here. Okay, there we go. It's working now. Yeah, Cindy mentioned there was a couple of documents that have been created. Now, I started my 6-month contract with the Ontario Federation for Cerebral Palsy back in the year 2000, and it seems to keep on extending every time I turn around. It's working now, Cindy. The first project that I had as a consultant with the Federation was to help develop a long-term planning and support program that Cindy is now running and managing very well. The second one was to write the book, Removing the Mystery. I'll hold that up for you to see if you can spot that or see that clearly. But it is an estate planning guide for families of people with disabilities. And the intent there is to help families to learn what they need to know about planning for the future for their children, or for their sons and daughters with disabilities. And it is available, I should say, through the Ontario Federation for Cerebral Palsy website. You're more than happy to go ahead and order that if you wish. The third project with the Federation was the writing of this trustee manual. And the trustee manual will become pretty much the basis of a lot of what we talk about this evening. It also is available from the Federation's website, and I encourage you to order that as a good reference guide for planning for people with disabilities. Big issue or comment that I should make now is, so you're a trustee of a Henson Trust. The bulk of this discussion or this presentation will be directed towards people who are, in fact, trustees. That's not to say that it's not going to be valuable information for other members of people's families, parents, people with disabilities, and so on. But as Cindy also mentioned, I really do encourage any questions that you might have. Please fire them off, send them on to me. I'll try to answer them live while we're doing the discussion. Cindy will certainly bring them in to me. And, you know, I find that some of the best presentations that are undertaken by myself are ones that I never quite finish my slides, because we're too busy answering questions from the audience. And that's the type of seminar or presentation that is most valuable to people, because certainly if one person has a specific question, I can pretty much guarantee that there will be other people that have the same question and would just love to hear the answers to. So I encourage you to fire away your questions as we go along, and I'll certainly try to answer them as we go. Okay, so, and also, as we said, we hope to have this seminar or this presentation finish within about an hour. And there is a lot of material that we'll be trying to cover. Hopefully it won't be too overwhelming for people. But you know, the main purpose of the seminar isn't to make specific trustees or give them all the information that they need to actually conduct their activities, but rather to give you a general idea of the kinds of things that should be in the background or should be in part of your planning process as a trustee. So again, the purpose of the seminar is to help share information on the duties of being a trustee, the rights of being a trustee, and more importantly, the responsibilities. We also hope that you'll get some general information on the how-to management of a Henson Trust. And by doing that, by collecting that information, I hope it'll give some peace of mind to you as trustees. We know that, or we hope that it'll also provide some peace of mind to the parents that are setting up these Henson Trusts, because they'll have a good feeling with the competency of their trustees and the support that the trustees will receive. And we hope to also provide some peace of mind to the beneficiaries of the trusts. They'll have the peace of mind of knowing that the trustee really has a clear set of rules and responsibilities and tasks to perform that will ensure that the quality of life that they enjoy will continue for the rest of their lives. And you know, we keep on talking about Henson Trusts, and these trusts have been in use for many years now, but the biggest issue we've come across is that nobody really has given any information or forethought into what it means to be a trustee. So when I started working on this project of writing the trustee reference manual, I spent a very, very long time, a full day once a week for a period of about 2 years, doing research to try and find out what the responsibilities and duties were. And I guess what that really highlights is that it is a difficult task if you don't have the information available to you. And I don't know how many trustees out there have 8 hours a day for 1 day a week for a period of 2 years that they can devote to actually learning what it is to be the trustee. And that's why this trustee reference manual is so valuable, in that the information is now located in one spot, whereas before it was 1,000 pieces of information in 1,000 different locations. So now everything's in one spot, and hopefully it'll be a useful tool to anyone who is actively participating as a trustee. We're talking about trustees. What is a trustee? And it's in the most basic, simple terms. A trustee is a person who will hold and manage an asset for another person. That's creating a trust. And the trusts can be logged back to way back in the days of the Crusades, where the lord of the manor would be gone for a number of years, and he would leave somebody in charge of his property. That would be a trustee relationship. When you do create a trust, the trust itself is a separate taxable entity, not a legal entity, but a separate taxable entity. And that's important to keep in mind when doing the financial work with it, keeping it separate from the trustees themselves, and just have it as a separate taxable entity. Now, the Trustee Act is one of the very important documents then that outlines the guiding principles of being a trustee. I'd just like to run through them very briefly with you. And the first thing is that the trustee must perform his duties personally. That doesn't mean that the trustee can't seek out help and have help in putting things together, but the trustee can't delegate the responsibility of being a trustee to somebody else. He can't delegate the decision making. He has to be the final decision maker, he or she, of course. And so therefore you can't delegate that. You must do that on a personal basis. A trustee, all trustees must act impartially on behalf of the beneficiary. The beneficiary of the trust, of course, is the person who the trust was set up to take care of, to enhance the quality of life. And the trustee has to act in the best interests of that person, as opposed to perhaps their own best interests. Trustees must invest the trust assets. It's not sufficient to simply put money in a bank and leave it there. They must actually do some investing. And very, very important feature is that they must keep the trust assets separate from their own. You can't commingle the assets, so they're totally separate, and that's one of the first things that the courts look at when they're examining the records of the trust, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But they look to be sure that the trust assets are totally separate from the trustee's assets themselves. Also, a trustee, as a guiding principle, must be available to provide an accounting to the beneficiary. What that means is that if the person who this trust is set up to benefit wants, at any time, they can demand to see a full accounting of the transactions and the assets of the trust itself. And the trustee is bound to provide that information if asked. And you know, it doesn't have to be the beneficiary that asks for that. It could be someone else acting on behalf of the beneficiary. So it's important then that a trustee has the records up to date at all times and has the information available should the beneficiary ask to see the records. And of course, the trustee must also, under a guiding principle, must act honestly and diligently. And they must avoid a conflict of interest and shouldn't profit from the trust transactions. That means that the trustee can't sell, for example, can't sell their products to the trustee because they would benefit or profit from that. So the trustee must act very aggressively at avoiding any potential or real conflicts of interest. They should never profit from being a trustee. That's not to say that the trustee shouldn't get paid for their services. I'm referring now specifically to the sale of goods and services to the trust. So these are the guiding principles that should always be kept in the background of your mind when you're acting as trustee. And for the parents who are also here today, it gives you a good sense of understanding, or a good sense that the trustees can't do a lot of things that you might think they could be tempted to do. They do have to act in a prudent way and impartially, and they must make sure that the beneficiary of the trust is the primary focus of that trust. Hopefully, too, by the way, the whole process of this presentation tonight will help provide the way of making sure that those things all take place. Now, back to the trustees. One of the big questions that many people ask is, why was I chosen? Why did the parents or my next door, why did my settlers of the trust choose me to be the trustee? And the easiest way to answer that is that the people who've selected you have trust in you. They trust that you exhibit the care and concern for their son or daughter's well-being. They trust that you'll be able to effectively manage the assets of the trust. They trust that you'll be there for their son in a fashion, or son or daughter, in a fashion very similar to what they would do when they were alive. And they like the fact that you have some very specific skills that you can bring to the table, all of which is going to help ensure that their son or daughter has the quality of life that they deserve and that the parents want for them. You're also chosen because you're, well, quite frankly, you're of similar age. Now, it's not a really good idea to appoint a grandma and grandpa to be the trustees of a Henson Trust for a child, given that the grandma and grandpa are most likely going to pass on before the child does. So in the long term, trustees are chosen, of similar age are chosen, simply because they are going to be there for the long haul. It's also quite likely that you were chosen because you happen to live fairly close to the person with a disability, so there's easy contact. And now it does work, or it can work, when people are not living in close proximity. However, it makes it a lot more difficult to really understand the needs and wants of the person with a disability if you're living 500 miles away. You may also have been chosen because you've shown an interest in participating in the life of the person with a disability, and parents have said, well, that's something we're looking for. And you may even possess the good basic financial management skills that parents feel are appropriate or necessary for the management of a Henson Trust for their son or daughter. Now, let's take a quick assumption. Let's make an assumption that all of a sudden you pick up a phone and somebody says, you are now the trustee of a Henson Trust. So first thing that can probably go through your mind is, my God, what does that mean? What do I do? What's the next step? What do I have to start with? And in an informal basis, there are certain things that you really should do that are not written in the Henson Trust or in the Trustee Act. The first of those first steps would be the personal issues. Now, what I mean by that is that your first reaction should be to secure the safety and well-being of the person with a disability. If that person is living with a parent who has just passed on, then someone needs to step in and make sure that their safety and well-being is being cared for, or taken care of. If they're living in a group home, then that's maybe a little different scenario, but you really need to be sure that that person's safety and well-being is taken care of. That also might involve contacting the caregivers of the person. You should probably also contact the other trustees to indicate that their responsibilities have already started. And you should really become familiar with the needs of the person. If the person is living in the parent's home, as I mentioned, and they can't do that on their own, then you need to step in and make sure that things are taken care of. You may also just want to take a look and review a life plan. Now, life plans are basically a document that outlines the goals and dreams and hopes for the future, because now the Henson Trust is going to be a big part of that future. It would be a good idea for you as a trustee to step in, look at the document, and get a general flavor of what it's all about. In addition to that, you should take a look at the trust document itself. Again, that's part of the first steps. Just after you've been notified that you are in fact a trustee, you should familiarize yourself with the Trust Act, or with the trust document. You should also review the Trustee Act, because that's going to be your guiding rules, your rules and regulations. And you might also want to take a look at the ODSP and trustee regulations. These are just very, very preliminary first steps to familiarize yourself so that you have a general understanding of what will be expected of you in the future. And of course, making sure that things are okay for the person with a disability. There's also some other miscellaneous issues that need to be addressed as part of this first step type of operation. And that is that you need to contact the ODSP. The ODSP is the Ontario Disability Support Program. And it's, I'll get into more detail about what it is in a moment, but they need to be contacted because typically the parent of the person, the parent who just died, is very likely the ODSP trustee. That means that that person is the one who receives the ODSP check often, who manages the ODSP numbers, reports to the government through the ODSP process, just generally takes care of the ODSP transactions. And that person is no longer alive. Somebody has to step in and take over that role. Very often the person who is the trustee of the Henson Trust will be the person that steps in and takes over that role. You also will need to share with the ODSP a copy of the Henson Trust. They will take a look at that trust that you're working under, and they will compare it to the original Henson Trust. If everything's okay, good, no problem. If there are some discrepancies in the wording of the trust, then there's another process that they will go through, which typically involves canceling a person's entitlement to the benefits. And then you as a trustee would have to go through an appeal process that generally can take anywhere between 10, 12, 14 months, and in order to get the person put back on benefits. They'll also want to put down, when you contact the ODSP, they need a name to contact, and I'm assuming again that would be yourself, you as a trustee. So there's some miscellaneous issues that should be addressed with the ODSP. We keep on talking about ODSP, and very often I use this terminology all the time, and it means something to me. I realize now that it might not have the same impact for you. So what is the ODSP, and what's up with that ODSP thing? First of all, the ODSP is the Ontario Disability Support Program. It's often referred to as a disability pension. It's available to people who are 18 years of age and older, who are of modest means, and who have a disability and live in Ontario. The maximum benefit today is $1,042 per month if a person's living independently, or $796 per month if they're living in a room and board situation. It's not just a check, though. I mean, a check is a very nice feature of the plan, but it's also a drug card, a dental card, vision care, and a variety of other issues that can be addressed through the ministry. I'm going to finish this slide, and then I'll get to the first question that seems to come in. Okay, the first questions, that's great. The ODSP also has an employment training and employment startup allowance. This is a bit of funding that can help people acquire the skills required to become employed. It'll help provide job search, if you like, so that a position can be found, and in some cases they'll even support a person on the job training. And it'll also provide a little bit of employment startup money, up to $500 for things like safety boots or uniform, things like that. There's also a community startup allowance available through the ODSP, and that's $799 every 2 years for people who are leaving one residence, moving into another. It's designed to help pay for things like pots and pans and draperies and perhaps first and last month's rent and that sort of thing. There's also repairs and maintenance to mobility devices available through ODSP. There's a little bit of funding for guide dogs for the food for the animal, for hearing aids, for diabetic surgical supplies, incontinence supplies, and so on. And the portion of the assisted devices program under ADP that's typically paid for by the individual is covered under the ODSP. So you can see that these are just the highlights, but you can see that it's not the lap of luxury, but you know, it's certainly worth preserving, and it's certainly something that's an entitlement to the people that who are becoming the beneficiaries of the Henson Trusts, and therefore I think it's something that's worth preserving. And that's what the Henson Trust is all designed to take care of. I'll come back to some more information on that in a moment. Excuse me. And the first question we've received is, can an appointed trustee hire an agent in trust, example a firm, using trust assets to pay for this help, to assist in managing the trust? You know, the question is, yes, can somebody, oh, by the way, this is from Cheryl and Bill, and yes, a trustee can hire professional services, professional help in managing, investing, doing all those sorts of services. However, the final absolute discretion on this, or the decision-making on the Henson Trust, must be the trustee's decisions. So you can get guidance and advice, but you have to make the final decision. And you need to be able to justify why you made that decision, given the criteria that you used, and you can't abdicate that responsibility. So that was the first question. Hopefully, Cheryl and Bill, that's helped with that. And the second one, is if, say, a bank is acting as trustee, how does this affect the personal carrying out of duties? Okay, this is from Mary in Sudbury. Thanks, Mary, for your question. See, a professional trustee like RBC or Canada Trust or any of those companies, basically they are trustees that are bound under the same trustee regulations and rules under the Trustee Act. So they are, they as the trustee are essentially a person under the regulations. They're a person carrying out the duties. So even though you may have 2 or 3 different trust managers over time, they are still under the same rules of carrying out the duties personally as an individual would be. They're deemed to be carrying out the duties personally. And again, of course, they're going to receive that kind of support and professional support that we referred to in the first question as well. Hopefully that answers that one for you too then, Mary. Thanks again, folks. I'd love to have these questions come in. You know, I've got 50 slides. I'd much rather not finish those slides. I'd rather speak to the questions that are coming through. At any rate, so we did, back to the ODSP, given a little bit of information about what the program looks like. And I have to go back to the fact that it's not the lap of luxury, but it is worth preserving. And in order to get the ODSP, though, people have to qualify. And the first area of qualification is liquid assets. The ODSP says that a person cannot have more than $5,000 of liquid assets and still qualify for those checks and dental care and vision care and so on. Now, a liquid asset under the ODSP regulations includes things like money in the bank, stocks, bonds, anything that's cash or easily converted into cash. So it couldn't be, as I say, stocks, bonds, GICs. It can even be things like coin collections, stamp collections, if they have a value. Now, there are a number of things that are excluded from that $5,000 calculation. One of those would be a principal residence. A person can own a principal residence and not have that count against them. They can own a car, tools of the trade, clothing, their personal furniture, and even a prepaid funeral. And that doesn't count as part of the $5,000 asset list. That's important for you as trustees because if you're going to purchase those things, those are exempt and they would certainly not disqualify the person from receiving ODSP benefits. The ODSP asset test also excludes up to $100,000 of cash surrender value of a life insurance policy, and that includes things called segregated funds. Segregated funds are investments that are issued through insurance companies, and because of their insurance component, they're exempt up to $100,000. That may also be interesting or valuable to trustees. But the most important part of this asset test is that the Henson Trust of unlimited value is totally exempt from the calculation. That means you could have $1 million, you could have $10 million in the Henson Trust, and it would not count as an asset under the ODSP regulations. And that's why this trust was set up, and that's why you're managing it. By the way, it also excludes unlimited amounts of value in the new RDSP, or Registered Disability Savings Plan. That's also an exempt asset. So one category of qualifying is the assets of the individual, and the next one is income. Now, a person receiving ODSP benefits is allowed to work, and any employment income that they receive is reduced, or 50% of it is taken off the ODSP check. And because they're employed, a $100 bonus is also paid back. So if somebody earns, say they earned at a part-time job $500 in a given month, then the ODSP would take $250 off the check, but because the person's employed, they'd add back $100 bonus. Now, where the income issue becomes very important for a trustee of a Henson Trust is that the first $6,000 that you pay out of the trust into the hands of the person with a disability or for the benefit of that person is totally exempt. So the first $6,000 in a 12-month period is exempt from the income calculations. In addition to that, and this is the most crucial part, is that any payment made for a disability-related item is also totally exempt. So I'm going to get into a little more detail about what those disability-related items are, but virtually anything that is qualifying under that category can be provided to the beneficiary of the Henson Trust, and it will have no impact on the ODSP regulations or the ODSP checks. By the way, the RDSP withdrawals are also exempt, but unfortunately, most other income that a person receives that doesn't fit into the employment income or voluntary gifts in $6,000 limit or disability-related items will disqualify the person dollar for dollar. It'll be dollar for dollar taken off the ODSP check until their check is reduced to zero. So what we or you as trustees need to do is make sure that when you're paying money to or paying money for the benefit of the person who is the beneficiary, you either categorize it as $6,000 in a 12-month period, no questions asked, or disability related, or unfortunately the third category would be none of the above, and it would be deducted from the ODSP check. We'll talk a little more about that in a moment as well. Now, what is the financial problem? The financial problem with the ODSP is that if the assets are greater than the allowed amount, $5,000, then they lose benefits. And if the income is greater than the allowed amount, they also lose benefits. So the Henson Trust was actually established to help preserve the person's entitlement to those ODSP benefits. And remember, for many, many people with disabilities, that ODSP is their only source of income without the Henson Trust. So a brief talk about what the Henson Trust purpose. Well, the purpose is to protect entitlement to ODSP. In addition to that, though, it is also the purpose of acting as a pool of money that can be used to enhance the quality of life of the person with a disability. And it also provides someone to manage the assets of that person, being you, the trustees. The history of the Henson Trust, I won't belabor this one too much, but it is named after a gentleman by the name of Leonard Henson. Now, Leonard lived in Guelph, Ontario, and he had a daughter named Audrey. And Audrey was a young lady with a developmental disability, and she was living in a group home run by the Guelph Association for Community Living. Now, Mr. Henson knew that if he left his estate to his daughter, she would no longer qualify for the ODSP. In those days, it was called the Family Benefits Allowance, but now it's called the ODSP. He also recognized that his wife had already passed on. He had no other family. So he had to find a way that his daughter could benefit from his estate without losing her entitlement to government supports. He talked to a whole group of lawyers from community living in Guelph, to the Advocacy Research Center for the Handicapped in Toronto, some people in the United States where they have similar problems, and eventually they all put together an idea. And that idea was to adapt an absolute discretionary trust into Mr. Henson's will. So the wording of the trust was put into his will. It was modified and adapted a little bit. And eventually, unfortunately, he passed on. His estate was transferred into the trust. And the Ontario government said, Audrey, you've just inherited $84,000. You're way over our limits. You no longer qualify for benefits. Well, the Association for Community Living, on behalf of Audrey, said, no, government, that's not quite the way it works. You see, this is a very special type of trust, and you can't cut her off benefits. The government said, well, we already did. If you don't like it, sue us. So they did. They went to court. And through a process that took almost 8 years, the final appeal that the government launched, the government kept losing these cases all the way through, and the final appeal that they launched was dismissed in the Supreme Court in September of 1989. Now, what that did for parents of people with disabilities is it gave them a vehicle in which they could put all kinds of money to enhance the quality of life of their son or daughter with a disability without interfering with their entitlement to the ODSP benefits. And that's where you come in. You, the trustees, are now the people who are managing that trust, that special trust, that won't interfere with the entitlement to ODSP, provided you spend the money according to the rules. That's the good news. The whole thing about a Henson Trust is how it operates. And that's what this diagram is about. At the top of the diagram, you see the word parent, and that's typically the person or persons that set up the Henson Trust. In their wills, usually, not always, but usually the trust wording is spelled out in the will, and they've died. That means that this Henson Trust is created. And the Henson Trust it's called an absolute discretionary trust because it gives you, the trustees, the absolute unfettered discretion on the spending of the money. So you as the trustees spend the money on enhancing the quality of life of the person with special needs. You'll see that off to the right of the screen. And you'll notice that there's a broken line there. The way the Henson Trust is worded states that the person with special needs never really owns the money in the Henson Trust. The only interest they have in that money is the money that is actually given to them by the trustees. And that's where we deal with the $6,000 limit on the $6,000 in a 12-month period and the disability-related items categories. So the trustees provide goods and services to the person with special needs. Eventually, though, that person is going to pass on too. And when they do, any money that's left over in the trust is given to the final beneficiary, the bottom circular oval at the diagram. And that final beneficiary technically owns the money that's in the trust, not the person with special needs. Therefore, the person with special needs can't be penalized for money that's held or technically owned by somebody else. And that's how we get around the ODSP rules. The Henson Trust money is not deemed to actually belong to the person with a disability. That's sort of the Coles Notes version of what a Henson Trust is all about. Now, Henson Trusts seem very mysterious to a lot of folks, rightfully so. And I think one of the biggest problems that people find when they're trying to manage these trusts is trying to keep organized, trying to keep all the documentation together. And that's where we've developed in the writing of the Trustee Reference Manual a concept of a record book. This would be, basically it's a binder or a filing system, usually a binder, that's designed to keep people organized, keep you, the trustees, organized. It's a place to store documents. It's also a place to organize those documents that you store. And when it's set up and maintained properly, it provides evidence to the courts, which we'll talk about again, that you are actually maintaining the trust in an orderly fashion. It also provides evidence to the courts that you have earned the fees that you're eligible to charge. So the whole idea in a recommendation that we make for this record book is that you establish one and set it up and use it as a good tool for yourself to keep you organized. What's in a record book? Well, it really has three main sections. The first one, section A, as I call it here, is the general information section. Section B is the meeting agenda and minutes section, and then section C is the financial records section. Now, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on the book, but I want to give you a flavor of what it's about. So under the general information section, the first tab, or the first, I guess tab is a good term for that, would be where the original trust documents would be stored. Remember, these trust documents are usually found in the parent's will, but they're the guiding rules of how you operate the Henson Trust. It outlines the principles to be followed, and it must be retained, must be available for review, and it should be reviewed on a pretty regular basis to make sure that you are in fact following the rules as set out in the trust. The second, or the next section under the general information section, is where personal information forms would be stored. These forms would be filled out for each of the trustees, the life, final, and 21-year beneficiaries. We'll talk about those potentially in a minute too. You'll have information on the advisors to the trustee, And the kind of information that we're talking about is names, address, contact information, the role within the trust, their advisors or trustees or whatever. It's just a place to store the information of who is responsible for the trust and who is a participant in the trust. So that's the second section of the manual. The next section would be a listing of investments and accounts, bank accounts. Again, it's just a listing, but you'd list the bank accounts, the checking, savings, petty cash fund, the debit card accounts, and so on. You'd also list the investment accounts. Maybe they're mutual funds or segregated funds or stocks, bonds, real estate investments. And remembering it's just a listing, not necessarily where the transactions are going to be held. So again, if there's ever a question from the courts or anyone else as to where are things invested, here's the numbers. Here's the items that are invested in. Another section of this would be the other assets listing. Now, a Henson Trust can own a whole variety of different types of assets, and they could be cars, a residence of the person, or any other type of asset that's owned by the trust should be listed in this section. Another very important piece would be an important date and deadlines section. It's a good listing, a good thing to refer to on a regular basis through the meetings that you conduct. It's a listing of important dates like the fiscal year end, the annual and monthly ODSP reporting dates. We'll talk about reporting in a minute too. There's a preferred beneficiary tax filing date. It's another issue that we probably won't talk about tonight, but it's an important date that has to be kept. The trust tax filing date, the tax information slip filing dates, 21-year deemed disposition date, the birth date of the person with a disability, and even the old age security application date. At 64 and a half, the person should be applying for ODSP, for the old age security and income supplement, and that's the date that should be kept in mind. So this again is designed to help keep you, as a trustee, it keeps you organized and up to date on important times that things happen so that you won't miss out on very important dates and deadlines. Another area in the general information section would be the Trustee Act. Really good idea to keep a copy of that and refer to that copy on a pretty regular basis to make sure that you're not going offside of what the Trustee Act says. And remember, it should be used in conjunction with the rules and regulations that are outlined in the Henson Trust. The Trustee Act doesn't negate the items in the trust as long as they're legal. So for example, if the trust tells you to have to invest in a certain item, then the Trustee Act is overridden, so that the Trustee Act doesn't say, no, you can't do that. You have to follow the trust if it's a legal thing first. Next section in the general information section would be a time journal. People who are trustees are compensated for their work, and this time journal just is a place where you record the amount of time that you spend on specific matters relating to the trust. It should be a separate page for each of the trustees. Remember, some trusts have more than one trustee. And it's very often, as I say, it's used as a backup or a determination of the compensation that you receive. Keep it up to date. Now, the second major category of the record book is where meeting agendas and minutes to those meetings would be stored. Meetings should be held on a regular basis. Regular differs from trust to trust and person to person, but they need to be on a regular basis. They should be formal, structured, and recorded. So that's where the minutes come into this. These minutes and agenda provide a permanent record of the trustee activities, and it's where you would report and record the salient points. And you keep them recorded there for posterity. If they're ever needed in terms of decisions that have been made and so on, there's a permanent record that the courts can look at, and you're all set. You don't have to worry about transactions or about explaining things that were done perhaps inappropriately. You've got the documentation you need. The next section of the next major category of the record book is the financial records section. And I keep on talking about this being in a binder. This particular section could very well require its own binder. It could be that large, or a filing system. But basically, this section is where documents are stored, financial records are stored. In the first tab, or the first section of this financial records, would be the banking documents. This is where you would record, or you would file the bank statements, the bank reconciliations for each of the accounts that are held by you as the trustee. You'd also have a similar section for the investment documents, where the original investment documents would be stored. Things like the mutual funds documents, the stock certificates, bonds, all those sorts of things. You would also have the decision criteria that you use to select those particular investments. And as the statements come along through the investment process, or the time process, you would store copies of the investment statements in there as well. Remember, the idea is to keep you organized. We also have another section, which would be the other assets. This would be where things like the deeds to the properties, to real estate, for example, would be stored. Ownership papers for vehicles would be stored, the insurance documents for them, the licensing documents. Again, we're talking about a storage facility for important documents. You would also have a transaction document storage. This is a place where the bank deposit slips and the checkbook would be stored. Invoices for amounts paid would be stored in there, and quotations for various purchases, all those sorts of paperwork, keeping in mind that you need to keep a good paper trail of all your transactions. That's where you'd store the documentation. And of course, there'll be a section for income tax returns and T-slips, T-information slips that are issued by the trust. And basically, the idea behind this is you have one source or one location for all the paperwork that you need for the trust. If you're ever asked, you pick up your record book. Here's all the information on the activities and the setup and so on of the trust and the decisions that you've made. So what do we know so far from this presentation? Well, we know why you were selected as a trustee, what it means to be a trustee. We know some of the immediate steps that you need to take when you are a trustee and when someone has just passed on. We know that the ODSP has a whole fairly significant set of rules and regulations surrounding the qualification process. We know that the Henson Trust is a very significant solution in terms of keeping people entitled to the ODSP funding, as well as having this extra pool of money. And we know that we have a way of keeping you organized. So far, so good. We're doing pretty good so far. But you know, the biggest issue that I think most people are concerned with and a little leery of is the financial. And what I'd like to talk about next is the what's next of the financial issues. And again, we're talking about the fact that now you know you have a book set up, a record book to keep all the transactions. What do you store in there? Well, the first thing you need to do is to establish bank accounts. And the name that goes on those bank accounts may be yours in trust for the person with a disability. It really depends on the trust document. Different wording comes from that, but it's certainly not your name alone. You should be establishing a checking account, perhaps a savings account, maybe a petty cash account. Again, a petty cash account would just be there to prevent or to offset the need to write a check for $3 to buy a newspaper or something like that. We'd have a fund that cash could be used for that. And you know, a lot of folks are actually putting up bank accounts now with debit cards and giving a debit card to the person with a disability or the beneficiary of the trust and allowing them to make some small purchases on their own. The only caution when you're doing that is to make sure that the bank is aware that you want no automatic overdrafts to be allowed on that. If automatic overdrafts are allowed, then there is a concern, of course, that money may be spent that shouldn't be, but also it's giving far too much discretion to the beneficiary of the trust rather than the trustee themselves. So you have to watch out for those allocations of discretion. So that's the first thing you need to do with financial issues, is to set up the bank accounts. Then you need to set up your investment portfolio. And the Trustee Act says that a trustee must exercise care, skill, diligence, and judgment that a prudent investor would exercise in making investments. So we're talking there about a prudent investor. And basically that means you have to act in a way, you probably have to take better care of the funds in the trust than you do of your own. When you're setting up this investment portfolio, you have to set it up in accordance with the rules that are outlined in the trust document itself. And even if there are no rules in the trust document, then you have to set it up within the regulations of the Trustee Act and Trustee Act considerations, which we'll talk about. And you have to keep in mind that prudent person requirement. So what is a trustee investment consideration? These are sort of the guiding rules for trustees' investment activities. And when a trustee is making a decision about where to invest, they have to keep in mind, and this is outlined in the Trustee Act, you have to keep in mind the general economic conditions of the country at the time, the possible effects of inflation or deflation on the investment that you're about to step into. You have to keep in mind the expected tax consequences of the transaction. You have to keep in mind the role of the investment in the overall investment portfolio. You have to keep in mind the expected total returns of the portfolio, and will this contribute to that? You need to keep in mind the need for liquidity, the need for income and preservation of capital, and most importantly, all investment portfolios in the trust must be diversified. That's specifically stipulated in the Trustee Act. So whatever investments you make, you can't put all your eggs in one basket. As trustees, you have to make sure that your investments are diversified. You can accept support from investment advisors. You don't have to do it all alone. But remember, the final decision on the investments has to be yours. You have to make that final decision. Another financial issue is securing the fixed assets. Now, very often a Henson Trust will be left with things like a car, perhaps, or a home, or investment properties, or whatever. You, as a trustee, have to make sure that those things are insured against loss from fire, flood, and acts of God. Simple insurance policies. You also have to pay the taxes and the utilities and maintenance, repairs, and even collect rents from tenants. So again, if there are fixed assets involved, you need to make sure they're taken care of. And you have to spend the money. You know, that's the fun part. It's really not hard to spend the money on taking care of the needs of the person with a disability, but it is hard to spend the money in taking care of the person with a disability within the ODSP regulations. So I'd like to spend the next few minutes on talking about what those ODSP regulations, what they're all about. Remembering, of course, that whatever you do spend must be either given to the person with a disability or on behalf of the person with a disability. I keep on referring to the person with a disability. I really mean the beneficiary of the Henson Trust, the one that's named that this trust was set up for. You, as a trustee, must use your full unfettered discretion. That means that the beneficiary can't come to you and force you to do anything. You have to use your discretion. You make up your own mind. But you need to make that up in a systematic, orderly, and thoughtful manner. And you need to get quotes when you're talking about substantial investments or substantial expenditures. You need to get quotes, written quotes. You need to keep invoices and receipts. Really what you have to do is provide a full paper trail. If someone comes to you and says, there's a transaction in the bank that says $7,000 was taken out, you have to be able to show where that money went, why it went where it did, and show that you've done this spending in a thoughtful manner. Questions to ask regarding spending. This is a sort of a checklist of things that you should ask yourself when you're about to spend a significant amount. We're not talking about the $10 or the $20 for a pizza, but we are talking, say, the $2,000 for a TV set. You need to ask, number one, will this expenditure further the goals of the trust? Is there another source of funding for this? But very often, things like wheelchairs will be funded by other government programs, so if it's funded by another source, you shouldn't spend the money out of the trust. It should be taken out of that other source. You also would ask, would the settlor, meaning the parent, would the parent who set up this trust, would they buy this item for the person? Does it make sense to you? Would a prudent person spend this money on this activity? And will it affect ODSP entitlements? So you ask yourself those questions. If everything's answered properly, then you go ahead and take it one more step. You have to ask whether or not this expenditure will interfere with the ODSP spending rules. Remember, the person can only have $5,000 of liquid assets. So if you're about to hand that person who has $4,000 in the bank and you're going to give them a $3,000 check to buy something, that's going to put them over the limits. So you can't do that. What you would do instead would be to, instead of giving them the $3,000 check to deposit in their bank to buy the TV, you would actually go out as trustee and buy the TV and give them the gift. That way, they still have it. Still counts as part of the $6,000 or disability-related category of spending, but it doesn't hit their bank account. Therefore, won't put them over the ODSP limits. You also, again, when you're talking about the spending rules with the income limits, remember there's three categories of income. First one would be category one, where the first $6,000 in a 12-month period is totally exempt from clawback as far as ODSP is concerned. Anything that's category two, which is disability-related items, is also totally exempt. And quite frankly, that's where the vast majority of money will likely enter the hands of the person, is through this disability-related category. And disability-related items, very often when we talk about that, people think automatically of things like wheelchairs and medications and things like that. But in reality, disability-related items are goods and services that are used to replace, compensate for, or improve the functional abilities of a person with a disability. That's the definition under the ODSP Policy Directive 5.9. And it further goes on to say that a disability-related item will facilitate access, participation, and/or enhanced functioning in any one or more of the following. And that would be things like activities of daily living, social, recreational, or community activities, education and training, housing, health maintenance, care and safety, religious observations, transportation, and communication. So you see that's really a very broad category of spending. And that's where the vast majority of money out of the Henson Trust will be categorized as. Just quick, a couple of examples, things that are listed under the ODSP regulations as examples. There are many, many more beyond this. But things like computers, hearing and visual aids, vehicles, support services like attendance, housekeeping, and rehab, and readers. Health maintenance, care, and safety, so even extraordinary food items and medications are covered. Renovations to a home or property to make it accessible or for health and safety reasons. There's education and training, so educational supports, sign language supports, hearing supports, and so on. Home and vehicle modifications to accommodate the disability. Day programs, day activities, recreational activities, and even home repairs and maintenance to permit continued use of the property. Only a very slight touching of the total number of items that are available under this category. People just have to use their imagination as trustees, and a huge amount of money can land in the benefit of the person with a disability without interfering with ODSP. Now, we talked about the first $6,000, the disability related. Unfortunately, there is another category of income that is not a good one, and that's category 3. These items are not exempt from the clawback for ODSP purposes, and it's considered income in the month received, which means it will quite likely eliminate entitlement to ODSP for that month. Clawed back at 100%. We try to avoid that if all possible. I just received another request or another question, and thank you again, Mary. It says, in one's actual will, is not the trust referred to as an absolute discretionary trust? You don't call it a Henson Trust. Very good point, Mary. And you know, in my practice, I get a lot of requests from people saying, I have this will and I don't see a Henson Trust in it. Because what they're looking for is the words Henson Trust. And in fact, I have never yet seen a trust or a will that says the words Henson Trust. Basically what it is an absolute discretionary trust. You will see some terminology surrounding the words absolute discretionary trust. But basically it's a series of clauses that, when formulated properly, form an absolute discretionary trust in the Henson format. So if you're looking at the trust documents, either the trustees or parents, and you don't see the word Henson Trust, don't panic. What you can do, if you wish, you can forward a copy of it to me. I'm not a lawyer, but I do know what a Henson Trust looks like. Based on the original Henson Trust, I know what to look for. I'd be happy to take a quick look at your will to see if it's in the original Henson Trust format. And again, as I say, emphasize, you will not see the words Henson Trust 99.9% of the time. So good question, Mary, thank you. Now, we're getting a little close to the timing on this. I'm going to sort of speed things up a little bit, but you know, we are getting close to the end. If you would like to have a question answered during the session, please forward it to us or email it to us as soon as you can, and then we'll try and squeeze it into to the presentation. Now, when you're going to spend this money, remember we had all those criteria that you looked at a minute ago. And again, you really, just as an overall view, you really need to satisfy yourself of the correctness of the purchase. You need to categorize the expenditure under the $6,000 or disability related or non-exempt. You need to obtain quotes and retain those quotes. You need to go out and buy the item, give it to the person, but keep the invoices and backup documents in case anyone asks for them. And then you need to update a purchases summary so that you have an ongoing listing of purchases that have been made, categorized in the right format as well. These are the steps that you should do when you're doing spending relating to the ODSP. Compensation. That's always something that trustees want to hear about, because you know you are entitled to be paid for the services that you perform. And the amount that you can be paid, it usually comes from one of two sources. First of all, the trust document itself could outline your compensation. And some trusts that I've seen, the trustee is entitled to X number of dollars every year or whatever the case may be. But lacking that, there still is a tariff guideline that is used. And that is basically the maximums that you can receive as trustee would be 2.5% of money coming into the trust in a year, plus 2.5% of the money going out of the trust, plus 1/2% of 1% of the total value of the trust for that year. So those are the kind of tariff guidelines that the courts look at in terms of payments to the trustees. However, you can't just arbitrarily take the money. You have to prove that you earned it. And that's done through a process called passing of accounts. I'll talk about that in a minute. But you are, of course, allowed to be reimbursed for any expenses that you incur on behalf of the trust. As a trustee, you're not expected to pick up the tab on the long-distance phone calls that you have to make or things like that. But let's talk a little bit about reporting by the trustees in terms of passing of accounts. The passing accounts is a process that should take place every 2 or 3 years, where you as the trustee take the records that you've retained or maintained throughout the process in your record book, and you present that to the courts. The courts will review the records. They'll look at the actual trust document, which is also in your record book, and they'll make sure or confirm that your activities are in fact in accordance with the regulations of the trust. And the record book is a great source of information to do this process. And you know, the reality is that passing the accounts protects you. It verifies that the actions that you have taken are in fact appropriate, and you're sort of given a clean bill of health and then allowed to earn income or to receive income from the trust. Cindy just gave me another question that I'll try and answer now. And it's just to re-clarify, the costs to pay an agent in trusts, these costs to pay the agent come out of the trust money, correct? Okay, I think what Cheryl and Bill are asking is, if we're paying somebody we as a trustee, if we're paying somebody to provide us guidance in investments, for example, and they need to be paid, can the trust pay it? And yes, of course, the answer is yes. That's one of the expenses of a trust. And as long as it's reasonable and a prudent person situation again, then yes, they are entitled to be paid through the trust money as opposed to the trustees' money themselves. Good question again, Cheryl and Bill. So back to the passing of accounts. It's part of the reporting process. It does protect you. It's a really good thing to do because it verifies that you're in fact doing what you're supposed to do. Excuse me. Now, there's other reporting that you have to do as a trustee. Now, typically, the trustees of the Henson Trust will also very often be the trustees of the ODSP fund as well. And that being the case, the ODSP requires that monthly reports be done. And the first one is called the ETIR report, or the Employment Training Income Report. It has to be filed by the 7th of the month following, and following the date of the transactions. And it outlines any employment or training income that's received by the person with a disability. And remember that the person receiving these benefits, 50% of their employment income is taken off, and $100 is added back to the check. So it may eliminate or reduce the next month's check. So that's the first one. It has to be done by the 7th of the month. Also by the 7th of the month, you need to report send in a changes report. This is a report that is only filled out and submitted if a change takes place. And the changes would be in things like address, marital status, rent or board status, other income, and gifts received. These gifts received would be the monies that come out of the Henson Trust. Now, on a monthly basis, by the 7th of the month, you need to record as gifts. But keep in mind that they won't interfere with the entitlements or reduce the check as long as they're within the $6,000 or disability-related categories. Now, as a trustee, you also have to do, for the ODSP, an annual trust activity report. The ODSP Policy Directive 4.7 says that you have to submit a report that outlines, documents, and verifies all trust activities for that particular year. If you don't, then the person gets cut off benefits. So what you do is you send in information about the deposits and expenditures, including any backup paperwork, copies of that, of course. And what you should do is summarize the expenditures in terms of the categories, the $6,000 disability-related and other, so that they can look through it and determine whether or not there's any adjustments to the checks to be made. I'm pleased to see more and more questions coming in. I guess my last little push for questions is working. Before I go to the next type of reporting, the question is, if a beneficiary is left money from other family sources, can parents be trustees along with a trustee of similar age? Once a parent passes away, would it be needed? Okay, I think what I'm hearing there is, can other people set up a Henson Trust where the parents are the trustees, the parents of the person with the disability are trustees of that trust? If that's what I'm reading, yes, certainly that can be done. And then when the parents pass away, another trustee would be appointed. Cindy, is that what you're reading into that question?
I'm thinking the parents are trustees while they're alive for their family member
For
with a
their
disability.
own trust? If somebody else
For
has
their family member with a...
if somebody else has set up a trust in their wills, like the grandparents have set up a trust in their own wills, certainly the parents could be the trustees of that.
Yes, that's what I think they're saying.
That certainly could be. And then when the parents pass away, a new trustee would have to be appointed to take over. So yes,
What is needed
Margot?
to change that? So
That
something in a
should
will.
be, the changing of the trustees, the succession planning of trustees should be taking place in the will, the document that's actually creating the trust. If there is no succession planning, the public guardian trustee steps in and tries to find somebody to take over the job. It's better that you choose rather than they choose who should be the trustees. So when parents are setting it up, they should make some sort of provision for replacement of trustees. Just a quick comment, and for parents that are listening tonight, in my will, I've set it up so that my trustees can select their successors. So for example, if one of the trustees moves to California, all three of them would get together and pick a successor to that person. Or if one of them dies, then the remaining two would also pick a successor. So I'd always have three people in place. And my thought process there was that there's a very strong possibility that somebody who could be an excellent candidate for trusteeship may not even be born yet. 30, 40 years from now, who knows? There could be other people involved in my daughter's life that would be ideal candidates. So I'm giving the trustees the ability to make that determination and to select a replacement. So I'm going to flip back now to the trustee reporting. I'm just going to flip back a bit. We talked about the ODSP monthly reports, the annual report for ODSP. There's also an income tax reporting. You have to do a T3, trustees have to oversee a T3 income tax return at year end, and you have to submit T-slips. This is where if you're sending money out, it's income in the hands of the person with a disability, you need to report that. And it's a little bit beyond the scope of this presentation, but in the trustee reference manual there is some documentation on how to do that. What's next? That's the huge question. Now, when a person reaches age 65 and a person's receiving ODSP benefits, they stop at age 65, and they're replaced by the old age security and the income supplement, and in Ontario also the gains program. The check amount is roughly the same. It's a little bit more than what the ODSP amount was. However, the good news is, or the bad news is, I should say, that the person will lose their dental coverage. They still have drug, prescribed medication coverage, but they will lose their dental coverage. And the good news, though, is that the assets and income rules that you're working with the ODSP are gone. They no longer apply. Spending isn't as restricted. There are certain levels of income where the old age security and the income supplement are reduced because of other income that's received by the person with a disability. But again, the numbers are so high that it's quite a relief compared to what ODSP provides. So after age 65, because they're replaced, you as a trustee need to take some actions. You have to apply for the old age security for the person, and this should be done at age 64 and a half. It takes 6 months to get on the system as a rule. So that's the good news, as I say, is the restriction in your jobs, all those reports to the government on the ODSP are gone. You no longer have the restrictions on spending, and it makes things a little bit easier. Also at that time, the Registered Disability Savings Plan, the RDSP, will have kicked in 5 years previously, at least 5 years earlier, and there'll be a lot more money available to help the quality of life of the person. When a trust does exist for a long period of time, but it will terminate eventually. Usually the trust ends when the person with a disability dies. Not always. Some trusts are actually terminated at age 65, so depending on the wording of your trust. But for the most part, and the original Henson Trust terminated when the person with the disability dies. At that point, the original trust document is examined, and the remaining funds, any remaining funds in the trust, would be distributed per the trust document itself. So in other words, the trust document defines the final beneficiaries of this particular trust, and your job as trustee is to liquidate all the assets and distribute the funds as prescribed. That's the end of your job. Yeah, you can sit back now and realize that you've done an amazing job of making a quality of life of somebody appropriate and enjoyable, and you've done what you need to do. That's the end of the actual formal presentation. Cindy and Michael, if there are any other email questions coming in, that would be terrific. I'd be happy to step around for a few more minutes. But in closing, I'd really like to thank all of you for joining us for tonight. This is the first time we've done a presentation in this format for the trusteeship. I hope that you've learned a little bit of information that will certainly make you realize that it's not as difficult as it might be. If you have, if you set up your record book, and if you acquire a trustee reference manual, or if you're a member of the long-term planning and support program, you'll find that the support will be available to you through the trusteeship issues. So at this point, I think that's okay. I've just been given word that we have no other email questions. You can certainly continue to send those in after we've signed off, and we'll get back to you with them. But otherwise, have a great evening. Thanks very much for joining us, and good night. The end. Okay, you need to do something to this mic? Shut it off?
Yeah.